Max Schmeling was born in Germany on September 28, 1905. By his teens, he was living with his parents in a fifth-floor apartment on Hasselbruckstrasse, a predominantly working-class district of Hamburg. Schmeling's family was no different from any other in the area. His mother worked hard at the postal service, whilst his father was often away from home, working as a navigator for the German shipping firm Hapag. However, the First World War had wrought devastation on Germany, both economically and politically. So by 1919, just 1 year after the end of fighting, many German cities had become battlegrounds with open fighting between various political groups struggling to take hold of the ravaged country. One such group was the communist Spartacists, who famously led an uprising in Berlin in 1919. One day, whilst walking through his home city of Hamburg, aged just 14, Schmeling himself was caught in the crossfire of a violent clash. A bullet ripped past him and slammed into the wall as he took cover in a doorway before darting to his family apartment. Meanwhile, rationing continued, and the German people were suffering more and more from the privations inflicted on them by the after effects of the First World War. At home, Schmeling's mother would often bring in extra food to feed her growing son, despite rationing restrictions, no doubt picked up through the black market. So this was Schmeling's formative years, an average German family with lives suddenly upturned by the war. A boy coming of age in a city of scarce food and outbursts of dangerous political violence. But it was at this time that his life changed forever, in ways that the young man could never have expected. In 1921, Jack Dempsey, the American world heavyweight champion, faced off against the French champion Georges Carpentier in a fight that would become considered as the fight of the century. The bout was shown in movie theatres across Germany for weeks. Having recently left school and taken an apprenticeship at an advertising agency, Schmeling spent some of his meagre earnings on a ticket to the fight showing. So captivated was he by the match that he went every night after work for an entire week. And that was that. Schmeling's obsession for boxing was born. He had set his sights on a new sporting career, and nothing was going to derail him from his ambition to enter the ring. Within a week, he had brought a pair of used boxing gloves from a second-hand store. Looking back on this time, Schmeling later remarked, "I still remember bringing home the worn and patched gloves, and how I hung them over my bed like a sacred relic. Boxing's lure, dreams of epic battles, had captured me forever." Soon the apprenticeship at the advertising office proved too uninspiring for Schmeling, and he left to take up work as a pipe fitter. In a bad twist of fate, he soon fractured his hand and found himself unemployed. With little work to keep him in Hamburg and a dearth of boxing gyms in the city, the young man moved to the Rhineland. After the end of the war, the Allied forces had forced the surrendering German government to agree to an Allied occupation of the Rhineland. However, the British Army in particular had set about establishing a number of boxing gyms in the area, and it was rapidly becoming known as the place to be for aspiring German fighters. Still in his teens, Schmeling had taken the long journey to the Rhineland alone, hopping aboard a third-class train carriage filled with coal smoke, with little more than a duffel bag with his clothes and his boxing gloves. Despite the mass unemployment of the time, Schmeling soon found work at a glass factory. However, the naive young man from Hamburg was dragged out of the factory by striking workers, who threatened to throw him in the Rhine River for breaking a strike. Schmeling was able to talk his way out of the situation before it came to blows, but nonetheless realised his job was over before it had even begun. Finally, he joined a well excavation company. The days were long and the work was physical, but Schmeling enjoyed the challenge as well as being outdoors. Eventually, the company transferred him to the district of Mulheim in the beautiful German city of Cologne. It was here that he discovered the Mulheim Boxing Club, which rapidly became his second home almost every night of the week after work. The Protestant Schmeling was even amused to see Catholic priests in hassocks sitting ringside at the club's weekend matchups. The atmosphere and training captivate him, and boxing was once again consuming his world. Initially, Schmeling was trained by Alfred Dubbers, brother to the future European champion Franz Dubbers. The sessions were serious and grueling, but nonetheless, in Schmeling's words, amateurish. However, Schmeling flourished as an amateur in the German ranks, eventually getting to the final of the Western German Championship, but narrowly losing on points. By 1924, Schmeling was fighting as a light heavyweight on the Western German amateur team at the German Championships held that year in Chemnitz. Again, Schmeling lost in the finals, but his prowess earned him the recognition of German sports writer and editor of Boxsport magazine Arthur Bülow. Soon after the championships, he was approached by Hugo Abels, a boxing manager from Cologne. Schmeling soon moved in with Abels and began a new, strict training regime. Everything now came second to boxing. On August 2nd, 1924, Schmeling had his first professional fight against John Zapp from Dusseldorf. He beat his opponent in the 6th round of an 8-round fight, and thus had begun his pro career with a statement. When the newspapers printed the story, he excitedly sent the clippings back home to his parents. Over the next 5 months, Schmeling fought 10 times, his hard right hand finishing nearly all of these encounters inside the distance. He was only defeated once, during a fight at the Berlin Sports Palace, when he suffered a ruptured eardrum and profusive bleeding, forcing the referee to stop the fight. Schmeling's winning streak continued well into 1925, again earning him recognition among Germany's sports writers, although his purses never amounted to more than 200 German marks. It was in this year, 1925, that Schmeling finally met the American hero Jack Dempsey, the man he had studied so avidly at the movie theatre and who had inspired his career. During a European promotional tour, Dempsey invited Schmeling to spar 2 rounds with him in Cologne in return for 100 marks and a rare opportunity to face off, even briefly, with the renowned champ. With the ever-pressing need for funds to support his fledgling career, Schmeling took a 4-week job training the son of a circus strongwoman in a travelling circus. So for a month, he lived among the acrobats and magicians, the fire-breathers and elephant keepers, training the son of a woman who bent horseshoes and snapped iron chains with her bare hands, a strange but fascinating experience for the young up-and-comer. Eventually, relations with his manager Abels became strained, and Schmeling moved on from Cologne, this time venturing to Berlin. After a 10-hour train ride, he arrived in the city in the summer of 1926, set on establishing his name as a prospect fighter in the German capital. Even on his first morning in Berlin, Schmeling was surrounded by posters advertising entertainment of all kinds, from cabaret to theatre to live music and, of course, boxing matches. He knew that he had to make it in this city if he was ever to forge a career as a fighter in Germany. Soon he met with Bülow and agreed to start training with German trainer Max Macon, with Bülow paying the 50 marks a month fee. The same day, he was taken to the fight camp just outside Berlin. Every day he was up by 6:30 a.m. for a run in a heavy sweater through the forests and hills just outside of the city. Then followed 100-metre sprints, hill runs and calisthenics before a massage and breakfast. The training fighters then studied fight reels with Macon before a 2-hour nap, followed by sparring sessions into the afternoon. A simple training routine that Schmeling took to immediately as a young man possessed of self-discipline and a love for pushing himself physically. Pretty soon, Schmeling had his first pro fight under his new trainer, a first-round knockout of August Wenger that earned him just 80 marks. The performance proved to all onlookers how the new training regime had transformed Schmeling as a fighter, as well as the danger of his punching power. Then, on August 24th, 1926, he had his biggest fight to date, a challenge for the German championship against Max Deichmann in front of 4,000 fans at Berlin's Luna Park. Schmeling knocked out his opponent within 30 seconds, earning the German title and 1,500 marks. His face was all over the next issue of Boxsport as the next big thing in German boxing. Over the next 10 months, Schmeling had 10 fights and won them all, 8 of them by knockout. In the 10th, he faced the Belgian Fernand Delage for the European title. Schmeling struggled badly to make weight and tortured his body with heavy workouts and hard dieting, but despite this, Delage gave up in the 13th round and Schmeling had captured the German and European titles within a year. Like many boxers of past and present, he set to work spending the winnings, bringing his mother and sister to live in Berlin and rewarding himself with a brand new Harley Davidson and sidecar. But the new toy was to be central to another fateful turn in Schmeling's life. One afternoon, racing through the beautiful Berlin countryside with his mother and sister, he lost control of the motorcycle, sending the trio off-road and into a ditch. He and his mother escaped unhurt, but his sister, Edith, was tragically killed in the accident. Next came a challenge from middleweight champion Hein Domgorgen. Again, Schmeling had a brutal time making weight, but a bizarre contractual clause kept him motivated. Domgorgen's manager was so assured of his protege's chances that he demanded the entire purse went to the winner. After knocking out Domgorgen in the 7th round, Schmeling went home with a cool 20,000 German marks. Domgorgen, of course, left with nothing but a sore head and his dented pride. In his next fight, Schmeling was back at the Berlin Sports Palace, this time against Italian Michele Bonaglia, with the European title on the line. After knocking out Bonaglia in the first round, the almost entirely German crowd of 8,000 suddenly erupted all around him and began singing the national anthem. Schmeling was fast becoming a household name in Germany, while fans all around Europe also began taking notice of the powerful German champion. During the mid to late 1920s, Germany, under its so-called Weimar government, entered into a golden age that encompassed not just economic revival, but a flourishing of art, theatre, film, music and academia. During this period, modernist and impressionist artists took new approaches to representing the human body, and many were inspired by themes of athleticism. Famous German sculptors Alfred Flechtheim and Ernest de Fiori were quick to make acquaintance with Schmeling in Berlin. Fiori eventually producing a sculpture of the 22-year-old champion that sought to capitalize on and epitomize the boxing mania that had gripped Germany in the 1920s. Rudolf Belling, a well-renowned sculptor and amateur athlete, also sculpted Schmeling, and artist George Grotz painted him in fighting pose after many hours of Schmeling standing awkwardly in Grotz's Berlin studio. The people of this new and unfamiliar social circle introduced Schmeling to the classics, which he began to read enthusiastically. He developed a new penchant for the movies and invested in a new tuxedo and tailsuit in order to look the part among his new friends. In Berlin, Schmeling began to spend time at the notoriously bohemian Café Romanisches, the favourite haunt of Berlin's arts society. Although he enjoyed the new adventure, the Hamburg shipping worker's son never felt truly at home here, instead spending most of his time at the famous Roxy sports bar. But all of the socialising and late nights would eventually catch up with him. When he got in the ring against the tough Englishman Gypsy Daniels, he was knocked out at 2 minutes 47 seconds of the first round. It wasn't until April 1928 when he was able to revive his reputation with a win over the heavier Franz Diener, again at Berlin Sports Palace. With this win he earned 30,000 marks and held the German and European light heavyweight titles along with the uniquely German Champion of All Classes title. However, during the fight, Schmeling fractured his thumb. For weeks he healed and attempted to restart training, but the delay in recovery meant that the German Boxing Authority vacated all of Schmeling's hard-won belts for his failure to defend them in time. On May the 18th, 1928, Schmeling decided that neither Berlin, nor Germany, nor Europe was big enough for his boxing ambitions. So he boarded the liner New York, bound for the United States, with his promoter Arthur Bülow. As Schmeling approached New York by ship, the city appeared to him to be the capital of the world. The Statue of Liberty, a horizon packed with skyscrapers, thousands of people hurriedly moving through the city streets, packed with motorcars. But, like so many other ambitious men and women from foreign shores, the road to the top in America was to be longer and harder than he anticipated. European fighters had a poor reputation in America for not lasting long against their transatlantic opponents, so Bülow struggled to get fights for Schmeling despite his championship pedigree. With his savings dwindling and Bülow proving himself to be less and less capable by the day, Schmeling eventually moved out to Summit, New York, to begin a training camp. The facility was owned by the wife of the Turkish ambassador, and each fighter had their own room and bathroom. The training regime was strict, but the benefits paid off. Schmeling eventually had his hand operated on to remove a bone splinter with a bill paid by the ambassador's wife. After 8 long months of inactivity in the USA, minus the fight training at Summit, Schmeling finally got a fight at the centre of world boxing, Madison Square Garden, against a rugged opponent, Joe Monty. But Bülow's inexperience with boxing promotion in America landed Schmeling with a terrible contract. The fight was signed for just $1,000, with Bülow taking 33%. Despite battling a heavy flu and the frustrations of the contract perhaps weighing on his mind, Schmeling impressed with a knockout win after a thundering right hand in the 8th to mark the start of his American pro career. Soon after the Monty fight, Schmeling parted ways with Bülow and signed with Joe Jacobs, a vivacious and frenetic American manager from New York. To his credit, Jacobs even agreed to manage Schmeling without a fee whilst he saw out his financial contract with Bülow. With typical energy, Jacobs set about marketing his new man with press releases, interviews, photo shoots and sports receptions, all intended to keep Schmeling's name in the public eye. Jacobs soon secured 2 fights, the first against the tough Joe Skyra that Schmeling won on points, and the second against Italian-American Pietro Corri, who he knocked out within the first minute. With 3 impressive wins on American soil under his belt, Schmeling next fought the former baker's apprentice, Johnny Risko, at Madison Square Garden. Risco was a big step up for the German, with wins over both Jack Sharkey and Max Baer. Risco came out explosively, trying to put Schmeling away early with a barrage of combinations and a dangerous left hook. But Schmeling, ever the technician, counterpunched, knocking Risco down in the 2nd, then again in the 7th and 8th rounds. In the 9th round, after soaking up yet more punishment from Schmeling and with little left in the tank, Risco threw up his hands and quit the fight. The sellout crowd erupted in a frenzy and, with another $25,000 in the bank, Schmeling was becoming something of a big name in American boxing. Offers from large companies and broadcasters began to come in, and the German ambassador even held a special reception for Schmeling at the German embassy. Before heading back to Germany, he signed a 2-year contract with Madison Square Garden. The difference between European and American culture was startling. As he later poignantly recalled, "In Berlin, my victories made me a figure in society. In the USA, they had made me a hero on the street. In Berlin, they had passed me around, and in New York, they lined up to meet me." Soon, Schmeling and his small team were heading back to Europe by sea. In a display of wealth and reckless celebration that is as old as boxing, Schmeling's trainer Max Macon bought out all 20,000 bottles of champagne at $3 a bottle on board the return ship. Thanks to prohibition, they were $60 a bottle on the New York black market. But the good times didn't stop there. When they docked in Germany, huge crowds awaited the champion at the dock and at every train station they stopped at on the way to Berlin. In the coming months, the German Boxing Authority returned the titles to Schmeling, and he was even cast in a romantic boxing movie called Love in the Ring, working alongside the comedian Kurt Geron. Sadly, Geron was later tragically to lose his life to Nazi murderers at Auschwitz concentration camp. However, despite his personal good fortune, Schmeling was nonetheless becoming more aware of the deteriorating political climate around him. Violence between communists and fascists was increasingly common throughout Germany, and an as yet little-known ex-corporal named Adolf Hitler was leading speeches to rapturous applause in venues across the country, including the famous Berlin Sports Palace where Schmeling earned his reputation. But soon enough, Joe Jacobs had come through with another American fight, and within 48 hours, Schmeling was once again leaving the fractious fatherland and sailing to the USA aboard the liner Reliance. His opponent was the big and powerful Spaniard Paulino Euskadun, who had a reputation for punching power and an iron chin. As soon as he arrived in North America, Schmeling was whisked away on a publicity train organised by Joe Jacobs that set off from Montreal. After this, he took up residence at Fight Camp in Lakewood, New Jersey, and the press were reporting on his progress daily, everything from his diet to his sleep patterns, his regime, and even the brand of boots that he wore. This was a kind of fight frenzy and scrutiny that the young champion had as yet never experienced. On June 27, 1929, Schmeling was driven with police escort to the famous Yankees Stadium, a venue he had stared at wonderingly when he first arrived in America. 40,000 fight fans packed into the stadium, and the gate was said to have taken some $400,000, an incredible sum considering neither fighter was American. Schmeling was to get 17% of the gate sales, but millions more fight fans were tuning in to live radio broadcasts, with the first ever live transmission between the USA and Germany being set up especially for the fight. The grueling bout went to the full 15 rounds. Schmeling hit Euskadun continuously with his notorious hard right hand that had sunk so many other opponents, but Euskadun never succumbed. In the end, Schmeling won 11 of the 15 rounds. Out of the profits, $130,000 went to the Milk Fund charity that fed poor American children, a philanthropic gesture that no doubt won over many American fans tuning in to hear two Europeans at the Garden. Some publications had even called it the Milk Fund fight. After the matchup, Jacobs continued what modern pundits refer to as the hype train, taking Schmeling on a promotional tour of 30 cities across the USA, building the name and reputation of his fighter among some of the sport's most enthusiastic fans. Sadly, the joy wasn't to last, as the notorious intrigues of professional pugilism began to entangle Schmeling, as they have so many other fighters in boxing history. The New York Boxing Commission was supposed to make a fight with Jack Sharkey, the American champion, but this never came through. Having signed a 2-year contract with Madison Square Garden, Schmeling was forced to fight the durable Englishman Phil Scott, a fight that would have been worth substantially less than a lucrative megafight against the American. Aggrieved and frustrated, Schmeling flatly refused to fight Scott and instead returned to Germany and spent much of his time doing charity bouts in and around Berlin. However, one man remained characteristically unperturbed. Joe Jacobs continued to push Schmeling's name in America and even mounted a campaign aimed at the New York Commission called Bring Max Over. Eventually, Schmeling received the news that he had been waiting for so long. He was to fight Jack Sharkey for the heavyweight title on June the 12th, 1930. On April the 25th, he set sail on board the New York and made his way to a fight camp set up on the estate of shoe millionaire George W. Johnson in Endicott near Boston. Once again, the weeks of training were a media circus, with American and foreign reporters swarming both men's training camps. This was the first time Schmeling became familiar with the hallowed American tradition of pre-fight trash-talking, although his German accent and reserved personality were a poor combination to win any battle of wits. In a fight billed as a battle between the old world and the new, between German stoicism and American vivacity, both men hammered home the international flavour. Sharkey declared, "I'm going to come into the ring wearing the American flag around my shoulders and then leave the ring as world champion still wearing the stars and stripes." While Max, modest as ever, replied, "I've never made a prediction and I'm not going to make one now before the toughest fight of my career. But I will do everything in my power to bring honour to my fatherland." The Yankees Stadium was filled to capacity with 80,000 fans in attendance. Hollywood celebrities sat ringside, along with Jimmy Walker, the mayor of New York, Jack Dempsey, Gene Tunney, Marlene Dietrich, and Walter Chrysler, the car magnate. At the opening bell, Sharkey came out in typically fast fashion, popping the jab and immediately trying to get at Schmeling with a hard right hook. However, Max had prepared and worked to slip and evade Sharkey's attacks and land hard counterpunches of his own. At the end of round 2, Schmeling hit Sharkey with 3 consecutive booming right hooks that didn't seem to hurt his opponent, who continued pressing his attacks furiously. In the third, Sharkey seemed more blowy, and Schmeling felt he could soon find an opening for a hard right counter, soaking up hard shots to the body as he weathered Sharkey's infamous opening storm. Suddenly, Schmeling was down with a crippling shot to the body and the bell sounded. Before he understood what had happened, the judges and referee were conferring, and the seconds from both corners had entered the ring, pushing and arguing. To the astonishment of Schmeling and the crowd of 80,000, Sharkey had been disqualified for a low blow, and the new heavyweight champion was Max Schmeling. In the days that followed the infamous decision, 47 US states accepted Schmeling as champion, all except New York. Schmeling's purse of 747,000 marks was temporarily withheld, and the New York Commission even refused to engrave his name on the William Muldoon Trophy at Madison Square Garden. It is every fighter's dream to win the World Championship and to win it on the biggest stage of all in the USA, but no fighter wants to win it that way. Schmeling wanted to prove that he could triumph over the best in the heavyweight division, but the disqualification had robbed him of his opportunity. Frustrated and depressed, he returned to Germany soon after. The German press ridiculed him as a hollow champion, and Berlin theatres even did sketch shows mocking the champion's victory. Amongst this niggling hostility, Schmeling nonetheless forged ahead, buying a thatched house in Sarov, Pieskov, an hour from Berlin, and moving in with his new girlfriend, the Czech film star Annie Ondra. In 1931, Joe Jacobs once again came through, this time with the news that Schmeling was to defend his title against American fighter William Lawrence Stribling, known as Young Stribling, a fighter with a frightening record of over 200 fights and 125 knockouts. Stribling had even had 75 professional fights while still at high school. Just as the myriad construction workers were putting the finishing touches to the Empire State Building, Schmeling once again returned to the USA. His manager, Joe Jacobs, had organised a nationwide promotional tour. In yet another remarkable instance that highlights how Schmeling's life touched on so many other historical figures of the 20th century, he was invited to meet Al Capone during his stay in Chicago. A stout man in a pinstripe suit picked up the German champ in a limousine. As they drove to the Capone mansion, more men in pinstripe suits and felt hats lined the driveway and manned the heavy iron gates. Schmeling nervously entered the reception room that was filled with politicians, lawyers, doctors and wealthy businessmen. Despite prohibition, the champagne and whiskey flowed. Schmeling spoke with some of the guests and had some short boxing conversations with men he did not recognise, but Capone never showed up. Schmeling was later to learn that Capone was arrested around that time for tax evasion. Such was the appeal of the fighter. Everybody wanted to speak with the champion, from ambassadors to businessmen to gangsters. Max soon moved out to Connaught Lake Park to train. Stribling, like so many fighters in history, was trained by his father. At the opening bell he came out fast, popping Schmeling with a fast jab. The veteran American thumbed Schmeling in the eye over and over, but was soon on the receiving end of punishment from Schmeling in the 8th. In the 9th, Stribling rallied again and bombed away with heavy rights and lefts. After the 10th, Stribling began to fade, but Schmeling came on strong, landing with hard rights and uppercuts. In the 15th round, with just seconds to go, Stribling's father threw in the towel. The fight was a pugilistic masterclass of skill and grit from both men, and the crowd reacted with a standing ovation. In the following days, Max was back in the papers. He was given the Ring magazine belt, and his name was finally added to the Muldoon Trophy. He had successfully proven himself against stiff American opposition. Sadly, Stribling was to die in a motorcycle accident in 1933, aged just 28. Max returned to Berlin the victor once again, but ominous changes in German politics marred any sense of triumph he had hoped to maintain. As he said when looking back, the city was filled with catchy melodies, while the brown shirts and the red front staged brawls in the street. By 1932, Schmeling had finally signed the contract for a rematch with Sharkey. Only a win over the former champion would solidify Max's rightful claim to the heavyweight crown. He travelled back to the US and set up a fight camp at Greenskill Lodge in Kingston, New York State. One Sunday afternoon, the then governor of New York, Franklin D. Roosevelt, arrived at Schmeling's camp to see the champ work. He greeted Schmeling with a smile and spoke with him in fluent German, having spent much of his younger years studying and travelling in Germany. Roosevelt stayed to watch Schmeling spar, whilst his wife, Eleanor, covered her eyes from the fighting. Even after becoming president, Roosevelt, a boxing fan and internationalist, sent Schmeling a photograph with a personal dedication. Yet again, the modest German boxer's life was intersecting with some of the most important people of the century. Schmeling and Sharkey's reputations sold out the fight to the tune of $500,000. Sharkey came out very cagey, much to the surprise of pundits and professionals sitting ringside and the thousands of fans in the stands. With a slower Sharkey standing before him, an opponent seemingly unwilling to commit, Schmeling landed hard lefts and right hooks round after round. Sharkey had some success with the jab, but at no stage took charge of the fight. After 15 rounds, with Schmeling dominating almost every round, it went to the cards. In a story as old as the sport of boxing, the judges' scorecards came back and awarded the fight to Sharkey, robbing Schmeling of his title with an infamously outrageous decision. Even champion Gene Tunney, watching ringside, declared, "That decision is a scandal. The decision is a disaster for the sport." Modern-day fight fans can see the footage online and decide for themselves, but there's little doubt who the real winner was that night, despite Sharkey's pedigree. At home in Germany, the political situation had continued to fall deeper and deeper into fascist darkness. By 1933, Hitler had been named as Chancellor. All around the country were the highly organised, intimidating marches of the Nazi Party and their uniformed SA brown shirts. One day, whilst having a new suit fitted at his Jewish tailor's, Schmeling watched as a parade of brown shirts marched past the store, blazing fife and drum and carrying the crimson-red swastika flags. But this was only the beginning of Schmeling's dealings with the Nazi Third Reich, an association that would mar his career for decades. Whilst out to dinner in the Hahnen restaurant on Nollendorfplatz in Berlin, an SA officer abruptly entered and brought a message to Schmeling that Hitler wanted to meet with him in person. Before he barely had time to compose himself, the fighter was picked up in a government limousine and whisked across the city to the Reichschancellery. Hitler met with him with both Göring, leader of the Luftwaffe, and Goebbels, the propaganda minister, at his side. Hitler and his cabinet members listened while Schmeling reported to them on the results of his fights in the USA. Hitler himself was an avid boxing fan and had written about it at length in his infamous Mein Kampf book. Now it was clear to all but the naive Schmeling that Hitler had bigger plans on how to use the now famous German champion for his own ends. Worryingly, members of the usual crowd at the Café Romanisches and the Roxy Bar began to disappear over the coming weeks that Schmeling stayed in Berlin, most fleeing to France, Holland or England. The Nazi regime was beginning to erode the life that Schmeling once knew. It was only a matter of time before it would begin to impact his American career, especially his relationship with Jewish manager Joe Jacobs. Almost as if to mirror the descent of Germany, Schmeling's career also took a downturn in 1933. He lost to the terrifyingly powerful champion from California, Max Baer, after the referee stopped the fight in the 10th. Schmeling called this the worst defeat of his career. He then lost a comeback fight against former college football player Steve Hamas in Philadelphia and began once again to struggle with his confidence in the boxing world. In his personal life, however, there was cause for celebration. He married his wife Annie Ondra on July the 6th, 1933, and, whilst Hitler sent them both a Japanese maple as a wedding gift, Nazi racial policy was forcing Annie's Jewish workers out of her film production company until she was forced to liquidate it. Schmeling would be forced to continuously walk the line between appeasement of and opposition to the Nazi regime throughout the coming years, navigating the eternal intrigues of the Third Reich High Command and its desire to exploit the fighter. In 1934, Schmeling once again faced off against the seemingly ironclad Spanish fighter Paulino Euskadun, 5 years after their first meeting. Schmeling fought the Spaniard in his home country and, despite being clearly ahead on any unbiased cards, was robbed of the victory when the Spanish judges declared it a draw. After the fight, Schmeling was invited to meet with the Führer, this time taking tea with him at his private residence and accompanying the new German dictator to his publishers. Hitler was obviously determined to benefit from Schmeling's fame and success as long as he could. In front of 90,000 German fans, Schmeling entered the ring once again, this time against Walter Neusel in Hamburg in 1934. For Max it was a one-sided affair, with the referee finally stopping the fight in the 9th round as Neusel was clearly taking an unnecessary beating at the hands of the former champion. Meanwhile, over in the USA, Max Baer had recently lost his title to James J. Braddock, a massive upset in the boxing world that would later be immortalised in the film Cinderella Man. In the background of all of this, however, was a rising star whose destiny would eventually collide with Schmeling's, the young son of an Alabama cotton worker, a fighter named Joe Louis. Eventually, a rematch was set up with Hamas on March the 10th, 1935, this time in Germany. Again, Max came out aggressively and continued the attacks throughout the fight, forcing the pace and maintaining a vicious pressure. In the 9th round, the fight was over, and Schmeling had avenged his defeat in front of a home crowd, who roared at the victory, and soon all were standing, throwing up the Hitler salute and singing the national anthem. The fearless Joe Jacobs, Schmeling's long-time Jewish manager, jumped in the ring and, with an ironic grin and a cigar between his teeth, also threw up the Nazi salute, to the anger of Hitler and his hierarchy. On July the 7th, 1935, Schmeling climbed between the ropes to face off against the Spanish Paulo Euskadun for the 3rd time, this time in Germany. He had a point to prove after a draw and a narrow win in the first 2 fights, but once again the impossibly tough Spanish fighter fought Schmeling all the way to the final bell before Schmeling took the fight on a wide points victory. Shortly after, the veteran Euskadun then made the trip to the USA to fight the revered young fighter Joe Louis. Schmeling sat ringside and was impressed to see the young American fighter comprehensively dismantle the man who had presented such a difficult opponent for him in 3 fights. It was as clear to Schmeling as to anyone else that the road to the top in the boxing game lay in a fight with the remarkable Joe Louis. Shortly after, Schmeling and Louis signed a contract and Max was back to Germany with his luggage packed full of Louis fight film reels. The only way to defeat the Brown Bomber was to study and study some more until he found a chink in the defences. Again, once back in Germany, Hitler summoned his favourite fighter to his private residence to discuss boxing and the upcoming Berlin Olympics. The Führer made it clear that he was unhappy with Schmeling fighting a black man and that the weight of the so-called Aryan nation was on him. American bookies were less concerned about the Nazis' need for a poster boy and had the fight 10-1 in favour of Louis. The US press even showed Schmeling in a cartoon guillotine. Nobody expected the German to pull off an upset against the purity and grit of the unbeaten American. For this fight, Schmeling trained in Napanoch, New York. His fight plan centered on getting close to Lewis in order to land a short, hard, or straight right hand. The hours and hours of studying the tapes had convinced Schmeling that Lewis's only weakness was a momentary dropping of the left-hand guard after throwing combinations. That was his only opening, a split-second gap in the defences in which to throw a devastating right hand. To get close to that, Schmeling knew he would have to take 10 or 15 hard jabs on the way in. His sparring and his road work was all designed to prepare him for this strategy that would take all of his boxing wiles to pull off. From the opening bell, Schmeling was amazed by the speed, power, accuracy and timing of Lewis. Time and again the German took hard lefts and rights to the skull and sickening blows to the body. For the first 2 rounds, Schmeling was forced to take relentless punishment as he tried to get on the inside, losing both rounds clearly. By the end of the 3rd round, having had some limited success, Schmeling knew that his plan could work. He had weathered the hardest blows and seen his opening after Lewis's punishing combinations. In the 4th round, Lewis made the mistake that Schmeling had studied so hard. His left hand dropped just an inch or two and gave him a space in which to throw 1, then 2 hard right crosses flush on the chin of Joe Louis. Schmeling saw the faintest dip in Lewis's legs, something hardly noticed by those at ringside, and moved in again with another hard right, dropping Lewis to the canvas to the astonishment of everyone in the crowd. As the referee's count reached 4, Lewis was already up on his feet. The inexperienced fighter hadn't made the most of the count to gather his senses, so Schmeling rushed back in, but Lewis stood firm. By round 5, Lewis was fighting incredibly on the back foot, and Schmeling forced the action, stalking his man around the ring. In round 6, Schmeling was able to land flush with several vicious right hooks, and Lewis was not looking good. Lewis came out in round 7 with some renewed pace and a change of plan, this time targeting Schmeling with venomous hooks to the body, especially with the left hand. By the 12th, Lewis was looking tired and his punches no longer carried the same sting as in the opening few rounds of the fight. Suddenly, Max hit him with 3 hard rights to the head that landed unimpeded, then followed another crashing right hand. Lewis staggered back onto the ropes and Schmeling followed up with a hard right and a left to the head that dropped the American star. With the Alabama fighter struggling to find his footing, the referee counted the 10 count and waved his arms over Lewis as he floundered on the canvas. The capacity crowd went ballistic at the outcome as James J. Braddock stepped into the ring to congratulate the German on the upset. That night, crowds in Harlem and Chicago mourned the loss by the fighter they had heralded as an emblem of African-American hope in a country riven by racial segregation. Papers over the coming days called it the fight of the century. Still badly bruised and hurting, Schmeling flew home on the Hindenburg airship just 2 days later, landing to crowds of cheering fans at Frankfurt Airport after a 50-hour flight, flying above clouds as high as Schmeling's soaring emotions. Following the Lewis fight, it wasn't long before Schmeling, his mother and his wife Annie Ondra were once again in the company of Hitler and the Nazi High Command at the Reichschancellery. Schmeling had secured access to the fight tapes in his pre-fight contract, and Hitler was eager to see the bout. The Fuhrer and others watched on ecstatically in the movie room of the Chancellery as Hitler slapped his legs each time Schmeling landed and shouted a kind of running commentary on the fight as he watched. Of course, the Nazis turned Schmeling's victory into their own, and his film was edited by the propaganda ministry into a pro-Nazi production shown in every movie theatre across Germany for weeks after. 1936 continued in bizarre fashion for Schmeling. His thatched house was burned down by a lightning strike, destroying almost the entire building. Not long after, he was visited by a high-ranking SA officer who informed him he had been awarded the Dagger of Honor, a prize already carried by some of Germany's most successful racing drivers and athletes. Schmeling, however, had a keen eye on his standing in America. Any direct symbol of the Third Reich attached to his name would ruin his chances of getting fights stateside. Drawing on his now personal connections with the Nazi High Command, Schmeling called on Heinrich Hoffmann, a politician and Hitler's personal photographer, to seek permission to refuse the so-called award. The permission was speedily given, but the request was just another indication to Hitler and to other Nazi officials that Schmeling was harder for them to control than they anticipated, and was slowly becoming something of a thorn in their side. The year continued slowly as a fight with Jimmy Braddock fell through, followed by another non-starter with English fighter Tommy Farr, who held the British Empire title. So Max filled his time with gym work, charity events and attendance at various local fight nights. When attending a fight in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, Schmeling took the time to meet his old friends Otto Warburg and the composer and musician Willy Rosen. They all dined and drank together and spoke of the old days of the Weimar Republic of the 1920s. When Schmeling returned to Berlin, he was abruptly summoned to the propaganda ministry. A photograph showing the three together had been discovered, and Schmeling was forced to explain himself. Schmeling was warned loud and clear about the danger of fraternizing with Jews. His championship belts did not put him above the hateful, racist laws of the Nazi Reich. Before the end of the war, both Warburg and Rosen would lose their lives at Auschwitz, two more of Schmeling's friends murdered by the very regime that was so desperate to exploit his successes. By the spring of 1938, Max was back in training for a rematch with Joe Louis. In the political world, the Anschluss had been completed, uniting Austria and Germany as one Germanic nation. There was an ever-growing sense that war was once again on the horizon in Europe. When he arrived in the US, Schmeling was this time greeted with crowds protesting his being on American soil. Boycott Max, Nazi Schmeling, the banners read. Over the coming weeks he received thousands of hate mail letters. This time, the Schmeling-Lewis fight was being written up as a battle between Nazi repression and American democracy. Schmeling was bitterly described as the show horse of the Nazis. Once again, 75,000 fans packed into the Yankees Stadium, with the great and the good and the not so good at ringside: Clark Gable, Gregory Peck, J. Edgar Hoover. Bizarrely, in his locker room, Schmeling sat alone as the crowd roared above him during the undercard bouts. Joe Jacobs had been banned by the commission for photographing a fighter with a beer barrel for a press release, and others had stayed away through fear of the negative press surrounding the so-called Nazi fighter. When Schmeling finally made his lonely walk to the ring, he was showered with cigarette butts, banana peels and paper cups, surely the most hostile crowd he had ever encountered. As the bell sounded for the first round, Lewis came out in a blinding storm of punches, lefts and rights from all angles to the head and body. Schmeling had barely thrown a solitary punch before he was down for the count after a furious and relentless pummeling from Lewis that put Schmeling away within the first 3 minutes to avenge his defeat in spectacular style. Back in Germany, the Nazi officials who played Schmeling like a pawn discarded him like a worn-out jackboot. The propaganda machine spun a story about Lewis having weighted hand wraps, but Schmeling was nothing to them now, and he had lost not just to an American, but to a black man, a mortal insult to the Nazis' perverse idea of racial superiority. But Schmeling continued to put the welfare and safety of others before himself throughout this dangerous time. In 1938, during the Kristallnacht, the night of unrestrained violence against the Jewish community, when the Nazi Party began rounding up Jewish citizens for imprisonment and worse, Schmeling hid 2 young Jewish boys, the sons of his tailor, in his Berlin apartment. Days later, he helped them get passage to Genoa, where they finally fled to Shanghai with their father. Schmeling never spoke or wrote about this action, something that saved the lives of those 2 boys as well as endangering his own. The truth only came out during a 1989 evening party at the Sands Hotel, operated by Henry Lewin, a man who had been one of the boys he rescued during those dark days. Following this, Max bought himself a small farmstead out in the village of Ponikel, close to the Polish border. He had visions of a quiet country life of farming and hunting and living with his dear wife Annie. On August 31st, 1939, however, he watched as divisions of troops motored past his farm and as squadrons of bombers passed overhead. The invasion of Poland had begun, and Germany was now inextricably on a road to war with the Western forces. It wasn't long after the invasion of Poland that Schmeling was inevitably called up to serve in the German army, or Wehrmacht. With his reputation in tatters among Nazi officials, Reichssportführer Hans von Schammer und Osten personally saw to it that Schmeling was called up. Initially, he was assigned to an anti-aircraft unit in East Prussia. Many of the men that he met were hopeful that the war would all be over by the end of the year. It was at this time that Schmeling received word that his friend and trainer, Joe Jacobs, who had been with him for most of his career and had brought him such success, had died. The frenetic pace at which he lived his life, along with the cigars and whiskey, had apparently caught up with him. With sadness over the loss of his trainer, Schmeling was soon sent to join a paratroop unit and was told he was there only to help train recruits. However, the reality was that he was just another soldier in the enormous German army like any other, and he was soon sent to jump school before joining a combat unit in Wolfenbüttel. In all of his time in combat training, he never even learned to fire his rifle. In May 1941, Schmeling was sent to Greece. The Italian fascist forces had entirely bungled their attempted invasion, and Hitler was compelled to reinforce them with German military strength. On May the 20th, he flew low over the Greek landscape before jumping into a hail of defending British flak and machine gun fire over the island of Crete. All around him as he fell were bodies hurtling to the ground as their parachutes failed, others hanging lifeless, tied to tattered parachutes riddled with bullet holes. After a heavy landing and 2 days separated from his unit, Schmeling finally met with them again. He was immediately taken to a field hospital in Athens with leg injuries and dysentery. At the field hospital, an American journalist interviewed the ex-champion. America had yet to enter the war, and her journalists were still reporting both sides of the conflict. Max told the journalist that he considered America his second home, and hoped that there wouldn't be a war between Germany and the USA. His statement made it back to Goebbels, who was incensed by the comment and sought to have him tried by the infamous People's Courts, a trial that would almost inevitably lead to his execution at the age of 37. As it happened, the trial never came to be. Schmeling was finally discharged from the army in April 1943, his total combat time being the 2 days he spent looking for his scattered comrades. Back in Ponacle, Schmeling worked hard to maintain the farm with his wife still by his side. During the intense Allied bombing of Germany, he and Annie took in some homeless children to protect them from the attacks, along with 2 young girls from the city of Kiel who stayed with Annie and Max for many weeks. He soon got a job with the Red Cross and was tasked with visiting Allied POWs in Germany's many stalags, attempting to raise morale by playing games, speaking about his successes and even holding exhibition bouts with prisoners. At one point he also travelled to Italy to meet with the huge Italian boxer Primo Carnera, who had joined the Italian resistance movements against Mussolini. In a bizarre twist of politics, Schmeling was also sent to Rome to meet with Pope Pius XII. The intention was to send an apolitical person to smooth over fractured relations between the Nazis and the Pope. Schmeling met with the Pope in his private chambers and had a short conversation. What good this did either side was a mystery to Schmeling, and he returned to Ponacle unconcerned with the outcome. The countryside around his farm in Ponacle was, by then, filled with German refugees and long lines of horse-drawn wagons, thousands fleeing from the Soviet advance. It was then that Schmeling knew he had to leave his home. He packed his car with the most essential items, leaving his hard-won boxing trophies behind, and set off to Berlin with Annie and the 2 young girls they had saved from Kiel. What became of his titles and trophies after the Soviets entered the village, he never discovered. After he arrived in Berlin, Schmeling decided to stay, and Annie continued on to the city of Rostock, while the 2 Kiel girls were reunited with their parents, no doubt thankful to the Schmelings for housing them during this terrible period. After some weeks holding out in Berlin amidst continued Allied bombing, Schmeling was forced once again to move as the Soviet army advanced to within a few miles of the city. When they finally captured the capital, there would be little mercy, even for a former boxing star. After the end of the war, Schmeling tried to be among those rebuilding the ruined city of Berlin. After eventually moving back to Hamburg, he and 2 friends, Axel Springer and John Jarre, attempted to establish a publishing business. Hamburg was in a territory under British military occupation, and because of Schmeling's association with the Nazis as an athlete, their license was denied. Schmeling therefore made the difficult decision to leave. He now had little left, his houses were destroyed, and his savings were once again dwindling. On September the 28th, 1947, at the ripe age of 42, he once more stepped back into the ring. This time his opponent was Werner Vollmer, a man coming off of 2 losses. 40,000 fans packed into a stadium in Frankfurt, including thousands of Allied soldiers. Schmeling won by knockout and went on to fight 4 more fights, losing 2 before retiring from the ring for good in 1948. Schmeling moved back out to the country where his heart had always remained, to live out his retirement as a tobacco farmer, breeder and hunter. In 1954, he travelled to the USA once more after many years away, to visit the grave of his former trainer Joe Jacobs at a Jewish cemetery. From here he travelled to Chicago to meet with his old foe Joe Louis, some years later Lewis flew out to Hamburg to return the favour. Jim Farley, ex-president of the New York Boxing Commission, had become a senior partner at Coca-Cola and offered Schmeling the chance to buy into the German arm of the company as its market expanded. Schmeling continued to run his Hamburg Coca-Cola business long into his years after retiring from boxing. He spent his free days hunting in the German countryside or with his beautiful and ever-patient wife, Annie Ondra. Testament to his integrity and sense of brotherhood, Schmeling continued to help Joe Louis and his family financially over the years, and when Louis died in 1981, it was Schmeling who funded the funeral over 40 years since the two had met in the ring. Max Schmeling was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1992 and died peacefully on February 5, 2005, aged 99. His was a life that spanned some of the most dramatic events in human history, a life that crisscrossed some of the most important people who helped to transform the 20th century, for better or worse. A life that was epitomised by hard work, dedication, and a tireless belief in the possibility of triumphing over even the most crushing adversity.